From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up today out of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Jim Robb is featured on this week's cattle market segment. He will remark on the USDA's latest cattle on feed report, and he'll offer the LMIC's latest outlook on calf prices heading into 2018. Then K-State's Keith Harmoney discusses a cattle grazing program that he's been studying at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays called Modified Intensive Early Stocking. He highlighted that during his presentation at K-State's Beef Stalker Field Day last week. And later this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Beth Hinshaw reports that applications are now being taken for the 2018 Kansas 4-H Youth Leadership Council. All that here on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Interesting developments in the cattle trade this past week. The USDA's latest cattle on feed report may throw something of a wet blanket on what was otherwise a relatively positive week. Joining us now is Jim Robb, the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center based in Denver. The fed cattle cash trade did finally develop on Friday late, and it was an easing to the upside, Jim, by and large.
We did. We had fully in the Southern Plains fed cattle on the cash basis selling at 108, which is $2 a hundredweight above the prior week, and supporting that was a box beef market that was up slightly for the week, and we actually posted our first week-over-week increase, and we were the highest since in about 4 weeks. So the meat market seemed to have had a little stability, and finally, we seem to at least have seen some light on the potential on the fed cattle side.
Eventually, markets that have been down for a time have to go up. Is that the case here, or was there a specific catalyst involved?
Not sure there was a specific catalyst. We are working towards the season of the year where we'll start to see some of the meat items carrying more value, especially the items for holiday season and retailers buying those. And, overall, I think the market's getting somewhat adapted to the levels of production we've had. We had slaughter last week up 6.9% year over year. So to have a stronger cattle market in the face of larger slaughter, and most of that year over year increase in slaughter came from heifers and from cow slaughter. So this is a market that I think overall, Eric, is dealing with the large supplies, surprisingly well, and a little bit of uptick last week is a good sign.
And all of that does apply as well to the bullishness we saw on the live cattle futures contracts as well, did we not?
We did. We saw some, trying to, from a technical perspective, trying to churn a little bit early in the week, and then some clear strengthening as the week progressed. And again, that also was probably supported a little bit by the meat markets looking a little bit better, and that spelt over, even the calf and yearling markets, even though they weren't up very much, they certainly have stayed strong, and most of the yearlings across the U.S. were up $2 to $3 a hundredweight for the week. Calves were kind of a mixed bag. In some parts of the U.S. we're getting quite a few calves coming to market, and in other areas we're not, and we actually have some very good grass conditions holding back weaning time. So that's more of a mixed bag on the calf side. But still, these calf prices last week were fully $20 a hundredweight above a year ago, and that's stronger than we would have anticipated a few months ago.
In a moment, we do want to get into the cattle on feed report's implications for the fed trade. But since you're mentioning the calf market, the Livestock Marketing Information Center has put forth its outlook on calf prices rolling into 2018 and maybe even a little further into 2019. It's been a good run for that calf market, but you are suggesting producers shouldn't expect this to be a runaway train by any stretch.
Well, I think if we look back to last October, it was kind of a very difficult market situation, and calf prices really unraveled. And we're having year-over-year increases. As I mentioned, we're fully $20 a hundredweight above a year ago this past week on 500 to 600 pound steer calves, And maybe as we work into the fourth quarter, we'll be $15 or so per hundredweight higher than last year. But we want producers to fully recognize that the 2017 calf crop is bigger than 2016. 2018 will be bigger than 2017. In that kind of environment, even though the fed cattle market and we're moving the meat through the system well and exports have been good, it's going to be difficult to have for the next year or two further year-over-year increases in calf prices especially. So this is a market that has very strong fundamentals, but the largest fundamental is the supply side, and again, the calf crops are still getting bigger. So we don't want to get overly enthusiastic on these calf prices that we're getting this year. We want to still stick to the basics and recognize the larger calf crops are ahead.
Now, that's not to say that a plunge in the calf market is ahead either, is it, though?
Does not appear to be, and does not appear to be like last year where the fed cattle market and the meat market and all those were churning and really not able to keep up with the growing supplies. But I think we're in a much different market environment this year. We've marketed fed cattle aggressively, and so, some of these fundamentals, even on the export market side, are very much better than they were a year ago at this time. So I don't think it's last year being repeated, but again, we have to recognize where we are cyclically in terms of the overall herd numbers.
Now, that cattle on feed report out from the USDA Friday afternoon, it rang bearish for the trade by and large, where placements exceeded by a fair piece the average guess by the trade.
The pre-report estimates had placements down fully 4% year over year, but there was a very wide range on those, some of the widest ranges on placements and marketings that I've ever seen, Eric. Mm-hmm. And so overall, placements came in up 2.6% year over year. That rounds to 3%. Marketings were still very aggressive at up 6% year over year. So the on-feed count was up 3.6% year over year. All those are to the upper end, especially the placements and on-feed number, to the upper end of this wide range of placements. So it's got a little bit of a bearish tone. And on those placements, as we dig down behind the scenes a little bit, all of the year-over-year increase in the head placed was in animals weighing over 800 pounds. And those are the heaviest weight categories, and that's a bit of a surprise. With the drought in the northern plains and how many cattle we placed already, I think most of us assume that most of the year-over-year increase in placements, if it did occur, would be in the lighter weight categories. And that turned out not to be true. So these heavyweight cattle are certainly destined to be marketed by feedlots in early 2018. And so it probably puts just a little bit of damper on that outlook as we get into early next year, given this large number about, I think the raw number came in 85,000 head above a year ago in that category. And those animals are going to come to market, like I said, in early 2018. So a little bit of a cautionary note, I think, overall in this recent cattle on feed report.
Now, the USDA was very busy last week also releasing a cold storage report. What implications were found there for the cattle trade?
Well, I think if we look overall at the report, month over month, both in the poultry sector and in the red meat sectors, the amount of frozen meat, which is cold storage, increased. But the important comparison is year over year. This draws a kind of an important dichotomy between the poultry industries and the red meat industries. The amount of poultry, both chicken and turkey, year over year increased fairly significantly, and that's largely indicative of their struggles both in the export markets and in the domestic side. As they've ramped up production, they've needed to put more into cold storage. And there's pretty stark contrast with the red meat sector. Even with the very large production levels we've had in the beef complex, year over year, the amount of beef frozen in cold storage was down slightly from a year ago. And the amount of pork in cold storage was down 5% year over year. So the ability to move a product through the marketplace has actually been very good for the red meat side. And again, with not having essentially a year over year increase in the beef market, bodes well for that we've been able to sell the product and really not backlog it all from a meat industry perspective. So, overall, this cold storage report bodes better for beef and pork than it does for the poultry sectors.
All right. One further item, Jim, and this is found as well on your lmic.info website. You've put together your latest perspective on the cull cow market and what producers might be seeing in that market as they would move cull cows this fall, for those with a spring calving herd, that is.
Well, we have a very strong normal seasonal price pattern with lowering prices as we get into September, October. November is a seasonal low as we do most of the culling, as you mentioned, out of our beef cow herd in the United States. And so, the normal seasonal pattern seems to be holding up this year. But I think if we look a little bit further ahead, these cull cows do provide some opportunities. The last 2 years, until this last year, 2014 and 15, holding those cull cows really didn't make very much money, if any money. In fact, some years the price went down from the fourth quarter into early the next year. This year will be a return to normal between the fourth quarter of 2016 and into 2017. For those producers that have, forage and can put on inexpensive weight onto their cull cows, seems like the rather normal opportunities are returning to the marketplace. We're not being overwhelmed by imported beef product, and most of that from Australia, New Zealand, and South America really does compete in what we call the cull cow meat marketplace, as opposed to competing in the steer and heifer meat marketplace. So, there's some reasons fundamentally. And if we look overall, the hamburger demand, which is also driven by cull cows, and it's for many of the types of product, it's also holding up rather well. So, there are some opportunities here this year, maybe more so than in some recent years, to look at some cull cow marketing plans and maybe not sell at the bottom of the marketplace this coming fall.
And we appreciate your comments as always, Jim. Many thanks for your time.
It's been my pleasure, Eric.
Along with us to provide his thoughts on the cattle trading trends, that's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center in Denver, a project co-sponsored by numerous land-grant universities, including K-State. A moment there with Jim Robb here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and for you on this next segment, information that was passed along at the 2017 Beef Stocker Field Day at Kansas State University. Our guest now was invited in to share his latest research findings on variations to grazing programs, specifically the season-long stocking program, so familiar to most Kansas producers. Keith Harmoney is the range scientist at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. Keith, you and colleagues on the Manhattan campus as well have been examining variations to season-long stocking. The general intent is to improve beef production and returns, right?
Yeah, basically what we're looking for is efficient beef production, and to go along with that, to increase the bottom line net returns per acre. And in order to do that, what we tried to do is we tried to make beef production more efficient, to try to find ways to get the greatest amount of gain from the most or the greatest number of animals that we have stocked per acre on pasture.
Well, you proposed two alternatives to season-long stocking, and we'll take up each of those. One of them is called a modified intensive early stocking, and this is a spin-off of the double stocking concept that's been around a while, correct?
Yeah, it's basically trying to capitalize on the benefits of two different types of stocking, season-long stocking and intensive early double stocking. We're trying to utilize the positive component of having animals, a greater number of animals, greater density out on pasture early in the season when forage quality tends to be greatest, but then keeping a portion of those animals on pasture late in the season so that they're able to utilize their selectivity potential to be able to select a high-quality diet and retain gain and put on more weight during the last half of the season.
So in the first part of that system, how intensive is the grazing program then? What's the stocking rate utilized?
Well, in our study that we did out at Hayes, we did a 7-year study where we looked at a stocking density of 1.6 times the typical stocking density that we would for stocker steers in that part of Kansas. We stocked at 1.6 times the rate for the first half of the growing season, and then we removed the heaviest animals from those pastures, and we left the lightest animals out on pasture to continue grazing through the end of the season. So basically we removed the heavies and left the light cattle out on pasture through the end of the year.
This allows things that the season-long stocking program might not allow in terms of resulting beef productivity?
Yeah, we ended up having a 23% greater stocking rate on those pastures because we increased stocking density for that first half of the time period. So we had a 23% greater stocking rate, but we ended up with a 26% greater beef production per acre at the end of the season. So our beef production efficiency was actually rather high because for each relative increase in stocking rate, we ended up having the same and greater relative increase in beef production at the end of the growing season.
And as you noted in your presentation, the big advance in that system was on the gains to the lighter calves. 100 pounds of gain that would not have been realized otherwise?
Yeah, with typical intensive early double stocking, all those animals are usually removed at the mid part of the season. And if you have a lightweight set of calves, those calves, would be light coming off pasture. Using this modified system, you have the opportunity to be able to put more weight on those lightweight calves, so they go in as heavier weight feeder. In the system that we used at Hayes, it ended up being that we had just over 100 pounds of gain on those light calves during the last half of the season.
So that's an impressive result. You were, of course, also interested in the long-term impact on the grass itself and whether there were any adverse results coming from that. What did you find there?
Yeah, increased production per acre beef-wise is not that important if it's not done sustainably. And so we kept track of vegetative production in those pastures and also the vegetative composition in those pastures over time. And what we found was that even with the modified system where we had the greater stocking rate during the early part of the season, we did not see any decline in residual pasture dry matter at the end of the growing season in any of the years through the 7-year time period. And we also kept track of vegetative composition over time. And our key grasses that we find in our pastures in the western part of Kansas, one of those blue grama, another one side oats grama, there was no change in their composition over time between the two pasture systems. So we were able to maintain pasture productivity as well as we were able to maintain our major vegetative components on a species scale.
So when you put all of that together, this system appears to attain its goals, and that is efficient beef production, without any adverse effects on the grass.
Yeah, it appears to, at least during our 7-year time period. And I suspect that we would be able to do that for a significant number of years further.
And before we move on to the other system briefly here, do you think this is applicable then to the other types of grasses across the state? Again, the mixed grass and the tall grass.
Well, it may be applicable, but in western Kansas, we have grasses that are more tolerant of short grazing. And so this modified system that we're using on an annual basis, that greater stocking density and greater stocking rate each year, it may be more applicable to the mixed and short grass regions where we have components that are more tolerant of close grazing, like blue grama, like buffalo grass, that are able to tolerate time periods where maybe they are utilized too much. But in the study that we did over the course of 7 years, we didn't see any adverse effects. But that system is probably more applicable to western Kansas.
Keith, you also cited work that's been done by colleagues on the Manhattan campus looking at a double stocking system, but then adding an extra twist to it, that is bringing calves back in for late season grazing. And you might outline that approach.
Yeah, the modified system that we used out in western Kansas was actually from the idea or from some of the work that Clinton Owensby had been doing here in eastern Kansas since the mid to late 1980s. That's where this concept for the late season grazing component came from. It was from his work that he'd done here in the tallgrass prairie. And in the latest study that he'd been doing, that is ready to be published, it was a 10-year study where he did an intensive early double stocking plus late season grazing in alternating years with intensive early double stocking with late season rest. So those two systems in alternating years was what he was comparing to annually using season-long stocking or annually using intensive early double stocking.
So once again, this is reflective of what we were talking about with the modified system. Has he seen, and have you seen similar results with this 2X stocking combined with late season grazing?
Yeah, in the study that Owensby had done, that intensive early double stocking plus late season grazing system had greater beef production per acre than intensive early double stocking on an annual basis or season-long stocking on an annual basis. He also found that intensive early double stocking plus late season grazing system had a greater net return over the 10-year course of the study. And so he was able to find that he got greater production per acre, greater net return per acre with that late season grazing component in a system. And he also found that there was no loss in vegetative productivity in the year following late season grazing. The pastures were able to recover in that next year where intensive early double stocking was used alone. Those pastures were able to recover and had equal dry matter production as those pastures that had intensive early double stocking practiced on an annual basis. So there was no decline in pasture productivity in that next season. Those pastures were able to regain their vigor and regain production, similar to what pastures are that are intensive early double stocked on an annual basis.
So, pretty ringing endorsement for these alternatives to season-long stocking in both cases. If a producer would like to know more about these systems, they are rather intricate in their management and their implementation. Where might one find out more about them?
You can get on our Western Kansas Agricultural Research Center website, and you can find my contact information there. Give me a call or shoot me an email. My email address is kharmone@ksu.edu.
Very good. And again, that contact information is at that very website as well. Well, Keith, it was good information that you conveyed to the attendees at the Beef Stocker Field Day on these alterations to our season-long stocking programs, looking at more intensive early stocking and coupling that with late-season grazing in a couple of approaches here. So thanks for your time and for the presentation.
Well, thanks. I appreciate you having me on.
Keith Harmoney with us. He's a range scientist for K-State, based at the university's Agricultural Research Center at Hays. He talked about these alternate grazing systems at the Beef Stocker Field Day 2017 this past Thursday at K-State. And we'll have more shortly on this Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This Monday edition of Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here to today's agricultural news headlines for you now, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, as the third round of renegotiation talks for the North American Free Trade Agreement have started in Ottawa, Canada, it's unclear how much trade negotiators have delved into the battle over Canada's supply management system for dairy, poultry, and eggs. Canadian officials appear focused on issues such as labor mobility within the three countries, which appears to be a non-starter with U.S. negotiators. Meanwhile, the White House on Friday sent out a column by Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross about how rules of origin are used to build automobiles. Ross stated without changes to the way that auto parts are factored, then negotiations will fail to meaningfully shift the trade imbalance, in his words. Now, reports from Canada state that U.S. has not offered any draft proposals when it comes to agriculture so far. When it comes to issues of market access and agriculture, Canada's supply management strategy, used for its 11,000 or so dairy farms, is the major topic on the table. That's because we've already duty-free access for everything else, according to the former U.S. agricultural negotiator under the Obama administration, Darcy Vedder. She says that even when we were doing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we were already operating under NAFTA, so the only unfinished sort of market access issue was trying to get more access for dairy, poultry, and eggs, their supply-managed products, in her words. Canada's system to protect domestic dairy production is translating into high tariffs and limited import quotas. Supply management has been a politically difficult issue for Canada, and it still exists because Canadian officials have been willing to make that a priority. Still, it affects Canada's domestic consumers who pay higher prices for milk or cheese than U.S. consumers. For example, Canadians may pay the equivalent of $5.70 for a gallon of milk compared to the roughly $3.50 a gallon for U.S. consumers. Vedder argues that Canada could compete in a broader basis on the world market, saying that that's a country with open spaces, cheap grain, and ample supplies of grass. If they decided to be a competitive dairy-producing country, they could be, says Vedder. Canada has about 959,000 milking cows. That compares to 1.2 million just in the state of Wisconsin. That makes it hard for Canada to keep giving up market share in its trade talks. Now, the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Ron Bennett, barely scratched the issue of supply management at a forum Friday in Washington, D.C. regarding NAFTA. He said the trade talks should do no harm to the current agricultural trade. He said regulatory changes could be made to streamline the approval of biotech products and pesticides. Last month, Bennett had told reporters that his association supported the Canadian government's position to keep supply management. Meantime, even as the NAFTA talks continue at a quick pace, the U.S. does not have a chief agricultural negotiator as yet. Greg Dowd, the former economist for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, also a former staffer for the Senate Agriculture Committee, was nominated in mid-June to be the chief agricultural negotiator at the Trade Representative's office. He has yet to get a confirmation hearing from the Senate Finance Committee. Now, Secretary Perdue is reassuring agricultural producers that export promotion programs will not be cut. Here's more from the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Secretary Perdue is reassuring farmers and ranchers that export promotion programs will be funded.
The first one is the market access program. Those funds were not included in the president's budget early on, but I think Congress understands the importance of those.
Bipartisan legislation was introduced in the Senate this week that would double funding for USDA's Market Access Program, or MAP, and the Foreign Market Development Program, or FMD.
Those are really cost-sharing programs where usually the industry participates, sometimes 50-50 or more with those programs for market access internationally.
As the Secretary emphasized, ag trade is one of his priorities.
We've created an Undersecretary for Trade, and he's going to need some assistance in helping to market these programs across the globe.
The Secretary made his comments to journalists in southwestern Texas. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, this week's edition of Tree Tales. And awaiting with that is K-State Forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
For 81 years, the forests and woodlands of Kansas have been inventoried by the U.S. Forest Service in collaboration with the Kansas Forest Service at Kansas State to track changes in the size and the condition of this valuable resource. Since 1936, forest land in Kansas has increased each year in area from 1.2 to 2.4 million acres in 2016. By definition, this includes trees an acre in size, 120 feet wide, and 10% stocked. However, for the first time since 1936, instead of forest land increasing in area, it has actually decreased in size. Reduction in forest land may be associated with removal of trees and woody encroached grasslands and the conversion of riparian forest into cropland. Regarding our most common trees, hackberry now exceeds cottonwood as the species with the most volume, followed by American elm, green ash, Osage orange, and black walnut. When it comes to tree numbers, Kansas has 838 million, with hackberry leading, followed by American elm and eastern red cedar. The large number of eastern red cedar points to the issue of its invasive nature into grasslands, while hackberry and American elm are an example of shade-tolerant species that can dominate much of our closed canopy forests in Kansas. This suggests a need to reduce the density of our Kansas forests through thinning, prescribed burning, and timber harvest. This will allow more sunlight to reach our forest floors, encouraging oaks, walnut, and other trees that require full sunlight to thrive. Thanks to an important partnership with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station and their Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, for the first time, Kansas has a statewide map of aerial photos of tree cover at a 1-meter resolution. This has identified another 3.8 million acres of trees in addition to our forest lands. This inventory will help us to understand changes in the size and condition of our windbreaks, shelter belts, and riparian woodlands, which are critical to our quality of life in Kansas. This is Bob Atchison with the Kansas Forest Service, encouraging you to learn more about the value and contributions of our forest, woodlands, and windbreaks. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob. This is Agriculture Today, and we'll return with this week's 4-H segment for you. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
You're listening to Agriculture Today, and now our weekly time set aside to catch you up on what's going on in Kansas 4-H. For those youth out there who might be interested in participating in the Kansas 4-H Youth Leadership Council, applications for same are being taken right now with a deadline not far from now. We'll find out more about what's involved here from Beth Hinshaw. Beth, as you know, is the Research and Extension 4-H Specialist for K-State, based in southeast Kansas. The council is a very important activity in developing leadership among youth. We've found that out over the many years, Beth.
Yes, it really is, and we are looking forward to electing our next Youth Leadership Council at the Kansas Youth Leadership Forum, which is November 17th through the 19th. And young people who are ages 14 to 18 before January 1 of 2018 may apply. And the way the application process works is they submit an online application, and then they also get 2 reference letters from either an extension staff or a 4-H volunteer And then they also have a signature page where they sign off on a couple of things as well. And so what's going to happen at the Youth Leadership Forum is that we will be electing up to 3 people from each of our extension areas to be a part of the Youth Leadership Council.
So it amounts to 12 council members overall representing the 4 extension areas. And before we go any further, to note those applications are to be submitted on October the 2nd, which isn't all that far from now, Beth.
That's correct, and all the information is on our state 4-H website, www.kansas4h.org, and it's actually under What's Hot, just right there on the right-hand side. And they are due October 2nd by 5 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Just to give a flavor of what's required of those who do achieve a position on the Youth Leadership Council, what are the sorts of things those youth are, in fact, engaged in during their tenure on council?
You know, they will have several, an orientation, a couple of retreats throughout the year, and then they are the ones who put on the Kansas Youth Leadership Forum next year, Citizenship in Action, 4-H Conference, which is our summer program for middle school age, and then they also sponsor the 48 Hours of 4-H service activity. So they have a lot of things that they do throughout the year, and then they have some other opportunities sometimes to represent Kansas 4-H.
And in as far as how those youth are selected from the applicant pool, they need to be obviously well-versed in leadership, citizenship, these sorts of things, right?
Exactly, and those are the kinds of things that they'll get to share in their actual application as well, what some of their different experiences have been.
So you can go to the website. We'll repeat once again how to access the information on applying for the council. You do note, though, that you'd encourage youth to basically apply simultaneously for a national leadership conference as well. You might explain.
Sure. Our Youth Leadership Council in Kansas is made up of the area representatives, which we've just talked about. They have a 1-year term. And then the other part of our council is made up of the young people who represent Kansas at the National 4-H Conference. And the application time frame is exactly the same as the Youth Leadership Council representatives. So we do encourage young people to go ahead and apply to go to National 4-H Conference. In addition to all the same things that we talked about, those on being council reps will do, the National Conference delegates would do those things as well. But then they would also attend a national conference April 7th through 12th, and that's back at the National 4-H Center in Chevy Chase, Maryland. And that's really a working conference where youth and adults are there at the invitation of the Secretary of Agriculture to, help develop some recommendations to help guide 4-H youth development programs nationally.
Very good. Well, whatever aspect of the Leadership Council an individual would participate in, it turns out to be a highly rewarding experience and certainly a tone setter for the rest of their lives, Beth.
Most definitely. And, having just wrapped up the state fair, it was just so great to see many of our council alums stop back through 4-H Centennial Hall or see them other places on the fairgrounds and reflect back on what a difference that experience made for them.
All right. Well, before we let you go, remind us once again where all of the information on the Youth Leadership Council itself and applying for it may be found.
It can all be found on the State 4-H website, www.kansas4h.org, and both items are under What's Hot on the right-hand side.
That key deadline for applying is October the 2nd, and at kansas4h.org you can find the application materials and information that you need to pursue this opportunity, young people. Beth, we appreciate the word. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Eric.
She's Beth Hinshaw, Research and Extension 4-H Specialist at K-State, again urging Kansas youngsters in the 4-H program, ages 14 through 18, if they're so inclined to look into applying for the next Youth Leadership Council, the 2018 Council. That process is underway. Selection to take place at the Youth Leadership Forum at Rock Springs in November. And to round out this week's 4-H segment, to remind you that 48 Hours of 4-H in Kansas is upcoming October the 7th and the 8th. That's a week from this coming weekend. This is the annual Kansas 4-H Service Challenge, where 4-H'ers and clubs, adult volunteers, and alums are all invited to initiate some form of community service in their locations. And there's plentiful support information for this initiative found likewise on the Kansas 4-H website, kansas4h.org. If your 4-H group hasn't settled on a service project yet, it's time to get that all tied off and ready to go. 48 Hours of 4-H, Saturday and Sunday, October the 7th and the 8th across Kansas. They're also asking that you register your service project at the 4-H website, so be sure and do that as well, kansas4h.org. Our time's away for today. We appreciate you being along with us, and please rejoin us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.